Hello, I'm Linda Graham, author of Resilience, Powerful Practices for Bouncing Back from Disappointment, Difficulty, and even Disaster. In this series of conversations, you'll learn from many experts offering practices that are helpful to them in recovering their own resilience. In this conversation with Susan Kaiser Greenland, we're learning the relevance of mindfulness for resilience for children of all ages as well as adults, and the importance of the worldview that mindfulness can cultivate of will see. Welcome to this conversation exploring resources for recovering resilience. Today I'm talking with Susan Kaiser Greenland. Susan is an internationally recognized leader in teaching mindfulness and meditation to children, teens, parents, and professionals. She's the author of The Mindful Child and Mindful Games. And when she developed her program, Inner Kids, that really pioneered bringing activity-based mindfulness and developmentally appropriate mindfulness into education. Susan and I met teaching mindfulness in similar venues to mental health professionals, which is such a joy. So Susan, thank you very much for being here today, sharing your time and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm very excited for your new book.
Thank you. So in this series, I've been framing resilience as our capacities to face and deal with the challenges and crises of life, to be able to cope skillfully and effectively with disappointment and even disasters. So in your working with children and parents and professionals, how do you see mindfulness as relevant to that view of resilience?
I think they're completely aligned, and I think that mindfulness and meditation practices are a type of exercise, for lack of a better word, that actually does build resilience in a very specific way, because classical meditation practices, the more formal practice, besides helping you become less reactive, which the informal practice also helps a great deal with, but the classical practices, the more formal introspective practices, they help develop a capacity to be able to tolerate difficult emotions and be able to hold them and to hold conflicting emotions and opposing ideas at the same time. I think it was F. Scott Fitzgerald who wrote that great quote, something like the sign of a strong intelligence is the capacity to hold opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still be able to function. And that's a skill and a muscle, almost a mental muscle, that needs to be developed, just like our hamstrings and our pecs and our other muscles, our physical muscles.
So do you have examples when mindfulness has been helpful to you or children you've worked with or parents you've worked with in actually being able to bounce back from something challenging? How could mindfulness promote resiliency in those situations?
Yeah, well, one of the things it does is it really allows you, mindfulness does a couple of things, especially if you're looking at mindfulness that comes out of the classical tradition. It's not divorced from the worldview. There are some approaches that are mindful stances of attention that are divorced from worldview, but the more holistic approach, which is the one that I teach and that does come from the classical training, that is not divorced from worldview. So part of it is the development of this worldview where we have a different way of looking at things, and it's not as linear as one might think. I'll give you a couple of examples of stories that I tell kids, and that my own kids who are now grown tell me that they have found very helpful. And one of them is the story of the farmer and the son, and they have a horse. And they live, I think, in the Himalayas. They live way, way out in the boonies, and it's a long, long time ago. And they had a farm, and they had one horse, and they relied on that horse to till the farm, and they couldn't really survive without it. And one day the horse ran away. And the neighbors came running over and said, "Oh no, this is terrible. What are you going to do? This is a disaster." And this old wise dad said, "We'll see." Next day, of course, the horse comes back and brings with it a new friend, which is this strong stallion. And the same neighbors come over and say, "What great fortune. Look at how wonderful this is." And the wise father says again, "We'll see." by this time the neighbors are thinking that this old farmer is like a real grumpy guy. Of course, the next day, the son gets on the horse, on the new horse, on the stallion, and tries to break him. And of course, he falls off of the stallion and he breaks his own ankle. So the same neighbors run over and say, oh, this is a disaster. Now what are you going to do? And the father says, we'll see. Last thing that happens is that the army starts coming through the village, and they are drafting for the army all able-bodied young men. And the son, of course, cannot go because of the broken ankle that he has. And the neighbors come over and say, oh, fantastic, you're so fortunate. And the father says again, we'll see. And the point of that story, and the point of this kind of mindset or this kind of worldview that we can teach, is that we never really know what's going to happen next. So we think that we know, we think we can predict, we think something lousy has just happened, but it could end up being excellent good fortune.
Mm-hmm.
Another one of the teachings of classical mindfulness and compassion, it's very, very helpful for resilience to tell kids and adults, is this idea of be grateful for everything, even the misfortune, because they can all be your teachers. And the classical story that goes with that, which is one of my favorites too, and also one of my son's favorites, and he's grown now. You asked for a story. This is a great story. He was flying back for a holiday, and he lives across country. And he was flying back from a holiday, and as all has happened to all of us, he's in the middle seat on a 5 to 6 hour flight. And when I saw him, I said, honey, how was your flight? He said, Mom, I was traveling with the Bengali tea boy. And I thought, oh, wow, this is, first of all, it was hilarious. And second of all, for a teacher who teaches that story to have a grown man now tell it back to them was fantastic. But here's the story for those who don't know it. There's a Bengali tea boy. The story is about a wise teacher who traveled from India to Tibet back and forth, and he taught at all these extraordinary places where he was treated very, very well. And he brought with him a tea boy who happened to be from Bengali, which is why he was called the Bengali tea boy. And what happened was that this tea boy was a disaster. He was constantly breaking things and spilling the tea, and he was cranky, and he was ornery, and he was yelling, and he was impolite with all of these grand people. And everybody said, all of his hosts said, please, let us get you somebody else to serve as your tea boy. You can't have this boy. He's such a problem with you all the time. It must be just awful. And of course, the wise old teacher says, no, I always want him with me because he reminds me to be patient. He's my best teacher. He reminds me to be patient. He reminds me to keep my balance. He reminds me to be equanimous. And it's the best thing for me is having him here because he's a great teacher. So that type of worldview, coupled with the actual practice of mindfulness, where you build the mental muscle to be able to not be reactive, or to at least be less reactive, and to be able to tolerate strong feelings coming up in your mind without reacting to them. That's the key. One last thing that's important, Linda, when you're talking about kids, is to remember that this capacity to be able to hold conflicting thoughts in your mind at the same time is a developmental skill. So young children simply don't have that capacity. So to try to get them to do that, for young children, it makes more sense to distract them from what's bothering them, to acknowledge their feelings, obviously, to let them feel heard and loved, and then moving attention away from upsetting them to the feeling of breathing or to the sound in the room, as opposed to trying to hold the emotion, makes more sense until someone's developmentally able to do that.
Right. So do you have specific go-to practices that you use to hold difficult or conflicting emotions, or to teach patience to yourself, or to have that worldview of we'll see and be flexible? What practices have been helpful to you?
It depends on, it really depends, even if it's not a developmental issue because of the children, it really depends on the capacity of the person that I'm working with at that very moment, and really trying to get a sense of whether that person has the capacity to just rest and try to hold the experience,
Mm-hmm.
feel it without getting overwhelmed. But the moment you see that somebody's starting to get overwhelmed, or the moment somebody's starting to feel overwhelmed, it's not a great idea. And this is just straight for the mindfulness piece of it. It's not a great idea to white knuckle through that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
that's where the idea of moving attention away from what it is that's upsetting you, or if your mind is spinning out, moving attention away from that to a neutral present moment experience. It can be the feelings of the bottoms of your feet against the floor as you walk. It can be the feeling of your breathing. It can be it can be a sound. It can be a word, like counting breaths. It can be a worry stone, or a something like this that you rub, or a ball that you squeeze, something where you're directing your attention away from what's upsetting you, until your nervous system, and you taught me a lot about the nervous system,
Mm-hmm.
Linda, until your nervous system starts to settle down and you get back to that point where you're open, receptive, and able to learn. And then, of course, you go back and you revisit the difficult experience.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're in that difficult experience, if you're starting to feel overwhelmed, it's not possible at that point. I believe you're one of the people who taught me that, to be able to kind of reason it out or think it through. So when you feel yourself going over a little bit, that's where these moving your attention away from the upset to a neutral or pleasant present moment experience makes sense.
So do you suggest or recommend that people practice these tools and exercises ahead of time so that they're available before there's really a stressor or an emergency?
Oh, that's key. I mean, to try to pull these out when you're under pressure for the first time, it's possible, but it's much more difficult. The other thing that I really recommend for most people, not everybody, but for most people, when they start to feel like they aren't resilient, when they start to feel like they're a little bit overwhelmed, is some kind of practice where they're not sitting still. They can be swayed from side to side. They can be walking. I mean, one of my favorite practices for absolutely all ages is a gratitude walk. In all of these gratitude or appreciation practices, it's important to remember it's not to like sweep the difficult feelings under the rug. It's not to pretend the difficulty doesn't exist. We acknowledge the feeling. We acknowledge the feelings the other person is having or the feelings we're having. But then for a moment, just until we can ground ourselves, then to take a simple gratitude walk where with each step, you silently say, or with young children, you can say out loud something that is good in your life right now, something that you're grateful for. And that's a reframing. That's a reframing technique that allows you not to deny what's actually happening, but to expand your view to include both.
Yeah, absolutely. So would you recommend that, or are there other things you recommend when it seems that people are really overwhelmed? The resilience is nowhere to be found and they're kind of stuck where they are. What could be helpful then?
Little things, small things frequently, short, brief little practices, just dropping it in, with what you're already doing, and dropping it in throughout your day. I mean, I joke and I say the Nike slogan should not be just do it. It should be just do it and know you're doing it. So, so the whole thing is when you're washing dishes, to wash your dishes, and when you see your mind wandering, bring them back to the feeling of the suds against your hand. Folding laundry, the same thing. You're noticing what you think about the future or the past. You notice that. When you notice that, you congratulate yourself because that's a moment of mindful awareness. So you know where your mind is, and then you bring it back to the sensory experience of folding clothes, folding out the wrinkles, the warmth from the dryer that's still in the clothes. Dropping those types of things into your practice, into your day over and over again will not only build your capacity for resilience, if you are feeling just fine and dandy, or if you are feeling overwhelmed, just that will help you, I believe, and you know this better than I do, settle your nervous system so that you're better, so that you have more of a capacity, more of a bandwidth to be able to tolerate whatever's going on at the time.
So in these last few minutes here, is there any other thoughts or insights about resilience, something that maybe we don't often think of or associate with resilience that you think would be important for people to know about?
Yeah, I think it's important not to have too narrow of a perspective on how to approach any of these things, whether it's resilience or whether it's just plain old overall well-being. And if we just think of resilience as a way of cultivating well-being, and it's not just the mental activity, it also includes fitness and what we eat and enjoying ourselves and the people with whom we spend our time, and really looking at it as a more holistic piece, of which mindfulness is one very, very important part, and of which worldview is one very, very important part.
Mm-hmm.
But also our minds, our minds change our bodies and our bodies change our minds. And so we need to have our bodies fit, and we need to be paying attention to what we're eating and how much we're sleeping. And all of that is part of the whole picture. It's not mindfulness alone may help us realize we need more sleep. But if we need more sleep, the only thing that's going to help is more sleep.
Right. Amen. So thank you so very, very much for sharing all these wonderful ideas and stories and practices with us. It's really very, very helpful and useful to people. So thank you so much for your time, Susan. Really.
Well, thank you, and good luck with the book. I'm excited for you.
Thank you. So this series is archived on my website, lindagraham-mft.net. May these offerings be truly helpful and useful to you and yours.